my life and the life of my colleagues could have ended that moment. That was the fact that we got a life out of it is a miracle. If we see things, if we see injustice, if we see things that we do really deeply care about, what brings joy is actually to stand up and do something about it. I can profoundly feel joy because maybe I made somebody else's life better.
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Christoph, welcome. I'm so happy to speak with you today.
Thank you, Andrea. Glad to be here.
Christoph, your incredible background spans the arts, media, social entrepreneurship, and humanitarian action, always with a focus to support people in need. What has been the fuel behind all your diverse interests?
So the fuel behind all my interests probably just stems literally from the fact that from the basic idea, I mean, if you remember the movie Dead Poets Society, it's all about Carpe Diem. And also from the fact that when you start putting yourself into the shoes of the others, you realize, first of all, I mean, I come from a privileged country, from a privileged background, so that there's a lot of people who do not enjoy the same that I have in my life. And I think from a very early stage on in my life, actually, I started thinking about death, about life has an end eventually. And that there was always a sense of urgency. What can I do in my life? And not just for myself, but what can I do to be there for others who need it more? And of course, all of this was underlined through experiences. I always believe that in life, one of the most important things that we have is experiential learning. When we actually sit, for example, in front of people who have very different needs, we start understanding where they're coming from. And it started very early. My parents, for example, who are both medical doctors, at the age of 6, already took me for the first times to take care of people with various physical challenges, disabilities, basically. And of course, it shaped my view and seeing like, wow, there's people who cannot walk, people who cannot do certain things that I can actually do. And that kind of was the groundstone for all of that.
I'm curious, why was death on your mind? Because often when we're very, very young, we almost think like we are invincible, right? What sparked your interest or your focus on death?
It's interesting because there was nothing ever depressing about it. I think it's just a pure realization that even though I might be just 20 years old and think ahead and think like my life is going to be forever ahead, there was really this sense of urgency. And it's almost like I always said, like it's this inner drive that it's almost like this little machine that I can just not switch off, and that I cannot ignore. And the more I would do things, the more I would be happy. This is what I realized. I had many friends who would say like, oh, Christoph, chill out, you enjoy your student time more. I was working when I was a student. I was volunteering with one of London's largest homeless shelters. I would do night drives, go around, help homeless people at night. And there was enormous energy I could draw from that. And then I was just simply also lucky. I just had a lot of energy. And one of the decisions that I took, for example, very early is I wanted more time in my day. And what did I do? I actually cut my sleep from 8 to 6 hours per night, thinking, great, now I'm gaining 2 hours every day of conscious being. And I've done this ever since. And that's been for the last 28 years. That has been my day-to-day life. And it just enabled me to do a lot more things.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the work that you've focused on over the years. For over 10 years, you worked with the ICRC and the UN in conflict zones in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, as well as South America. Can you share with us what happened in 2006 while you were in Chad on a humanitarian mission that turned into a violent ambush?
Yeah, so I was actually sent into the region in 2006 on an emergency mission. And when I was briefed in Geneva at the headquarters, basically, I was just told, we don't know what's happening. It's super violent. A lot of people have been killed, and we literally got into huge transportation planes, brought in all our equipment, jeeps, and so on. And I was actually sent to the Central African Republic, and and so we opened this emergency office in the north of the country, and what we encountered was far worse than anything I had expected. Yeah, so people were killed, like literally slaughtered in the different villages. I've never seen so many dead people in my life. And my role was really to lead the humanitarian response to that. But first of all, we really needed to understand and to establish contact to all the different conflict parties, which were governments, which was four rebel groups, which was the National Army. It was really a mess of different armed actors, you know. And I remember once we came back, it was on the 3rd of July, actually, in 2006. We were just driving back. We had gone to a village on the border with Chad, where there were some mass killings, and we were following up on this ones. And when we came back from this mission, we basically were driving. I mean, you can imagine this almost beautiful, peaceful African landscape. You know, there's jungle, and it's hot and everything. And so we're driving along with this very clearly marked humanitarian jeep, and suddenly, bang, we're hearing this shot. Yeah, and we're like, whoa, what's going on here? You know. And so I'm asking, there was next to me was my driver, and then basically my field assistant sitting in the backside. And we said, like, but we couldn't turn around. It was like this narrow sort of dirt track, and we could see in the distance, we could see a truck coming our way, which wasn't unusual on that side, because these were kind of commercial trucks going between Chad and Central African Republic. And suddenly, as we're driving along, bang, I see like these four black dressed people jumping up from the top of the truck, with Kalashnikovs. Yeah. And as we're approaching the truck, just they're like opening fire, full blast on us. And this was a non-armored jeep. So of course the bullets, bang, they went straight through the vehicle. I was screaming at the driver, like, go, go, like it was very clear that this was not an invitation for tea here, and there was no room for negotiation in that moment. And so it was like a full blast attack. And basically we were ducking down in the jeep, trying to hide from the bullets. And it's like, just to imagine the scene inside, bam, all these bullets flying around our heads, plastic, glass, everything flying. And it really seemed like as if this metal cabin of this jeep was almost like made out of rubber. It was like everything went through. And we were all down, and the driver was pushing the pedal, but the vehicle, the Land Cruiser, was in first gear, and it was like, it had this really like super noise, but we couldn't change the gears, and we didn't see anything. We were really driving blindly. But luckily, we didn't lose control over the vehicle. And basically, we came closer, then we passed by, then they started shooting from the top. We managed still, we were rolling. They luckily didn't hit any of the tires. The engine miraculously continued running. And then basically, as we passed by, for a quick moment, there was silence, no shooting. And I quickly got up just for a quick moment, and I look back, and I see these guys reloading, and bang, starting to shoot again. And then from the backside, and I so remember still this bullet, like literally flying by my ear and smashing through the radio in the front of me. And then eventually, and this was our luck, first of all, we didn't lose the track. We stayed on that track. And then came the moment we were out of reach of the guns. And that was the moment when I was jumping up, and I was like looking around, is everybody okay? Is everybody okay? And then suddenly Simon, sort of the field assistant from the back, he like was up, is like, I'm okay. And then Dieudonné, who's the driver on the side, he's like, yes, I'm okay. And it was a miracle. None of us had been hit in this moment. And so basically it was one of the most violent attacks that happened against humanitarians in that particular year. And as a consequence of it, we all suffered from severe PTSD. It was really, really bad. but I had to continue leading the country operations. There was no replacement for me. I mean, you really have to imagine we were at the end of the world. The only thing that connected us to the outside world were satellite phones that didn't always work. So it was a very impressive situation. And I really learned so much about leading in extreme situations just simply because I was under the complete scrutiny of this PTSD, which is a very physical form of trauma. It's the most severe form of trauma. A lot of ex-combatants have it, or humanitarians, or people can be also in our everyday life. You know, people victims of rape or of a traffic accident or something very dramatic happening. And so I found myself in the middle of the jungle, not having the opportunity, for example, to go to therapy or things like that. But I just had to continue going. And I had to keep on going for another 5 weeks. And we started a massive humanitarian response because there were tens of thousands of people displaced, torture, widespread torture. It was extremely challenging.
Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, it just seems miraculous as you've described that you're, you're good, and the two other people that were with you. One of the first questions, and there's many that I have, was how did your life change after this experience?
Yeah, life changed in many ways. You know, it's quite obvious. I think everybody who has a kind of a near-death experience, if we would call it this way, and it could be any kind of extreme experience like that. It could be also that you suffered from a severe disease or something. I think it always changes your life because, one, again, my life could have ended. My life and the life of my colleagues could have ended that moment. You know, that was the fact that we got alive out of it is a miracle. Yeah. So it's very clear. Suddenly you think to yourself, wow, I've been given the gift to move forward. You know, it was decided it's not my day yet. And so it made me even more aware, and also aware in a sense. It's when you're in a conflict, you know, we see all of this going across our screens every day. There's conflicts going on, Ukraine, Gaza, you name it, Israel. There's so much happening. And at the same time, most of the time, these are anonymous numbers, people maybe. But the moment, first of all, you experience this violence yourself, targeted on you, it takes a whole different perspective. And secondly, it brings a whole different level of sympathy, what it means to live in such an environment. So it's almost a bit like an additional boost to duty, if we want to call it this way, to actually try to do more for these people and in these situations. So for me, it was just, if you want to see it, it was again a bit of a shift. What I had imagined in my 20s when I kind of altered or changed my life to some extent to live after the philosophy of Carpe Diem, this was a stark reminder, yes, any moment it can end or drastically change.
And you touched upon earlier that you've learned many lessons regarding leadership, particularly leading in volatile and shifting environments. Can you share more details with us about how those experiences have shaped the leader that you are today?
Yes, I mean, so first of all, I think leadership starts first and foremost with yourself. Yeah. So I think it's super important as a leader, for example, I needed in this moment. Yes, of course, I had severe PTSD. It was super hard. I mean, PTSD is like, just to give you a visual of how that looks like. I mean, literally, I'd lost appetite. I had constant nightmares. I couldn't sleep. I would be waking up screaming at night in panic. Yeah, it was just very physical. Yeah, so it's almost like as if somebody's constantly there and shaking you, and you don't have an option to actually get out of it. But at the same time, what I really learned is that I needed to be there for the team. So there's two parts to that. So me, I needed to be there for the team. So my role was to be a leader and to be the captain on the boat. Because as soon as once this incident had happened, the violence exploded even more in the region, and we were nonstop out there trying to save as many lives as we could. But of course, people were suffering in the team. I needed to find also joyful moments. You know, I needed to help them to cheer up in this really quite disastrous situation. Um, And it gave me one, the perspective that leading yourself first and foremost is important. You have to take care of yourself. For example, I went really every day. I tried to go for a run. Something like that would help me just to stay on top of things. But then the other thing I really learned is that the team is everything. That's why I think I'm a little bit over this, oh, the leader, the big, it's almost like this icon standing in front of everybody else, which is not, because ultimately without a good team, you're nothing as a leader. Yeah. So my role was really just to be a bit of the master of ceremony, trying to help them to be their best, and really also rely on the fact that I could be vulnerable. Yeah, there were moments we were just sitting together and literally like almost crying because it was difficult. And that was okay. And then we had moments where we were just laughing our heads off, and sometimes for ridiculous things, but it just helped us to take the edge off. Um, Another one that I really learned here is it is important to face, if you want, so face your enemy head on. Try to understand. Yeah. So over my time in conflicts, and not just in the Central African Republic, I had to negotiate many times with various rebel leaders, army, whatever, people that we would consider sometimes terrorists, would be described as such, etc. But it was part of my neutral humanitarian role to go to get to these people, for example, for hostage releases, child soldiers, all kinds of topics. And first and foremost, I met them as people. That was very important. For me, they were persons, and that's allowed me to really connect and open a gate. If I would just walk in right away and say, like, "Ah, you're a terrible person, what have you done?" Then I would close that gate right away. So that was very, very important to have this capacity to understand also where they're coming from, even though in many cases we will completely disagree on whatever they're thinking or doing. Yeah. But that allowed in many cases to really open doors. I mean, sometimes, I remember when I was, for example, in Nepal during the civil war, I had hostage negotiations that sometimes lasted for a whole year until those people were released. Yeah. But you had to build up a relationship step by step, you know. And maybe as a leader also is a lot about gratitude. I learned one thing is a lot to say thank you to also to the team, because again, you as a leader, you're important, but the team is equally important. And I thought it's so good actually just to hear thank you for everything that you do. And that is such a boost of motivation. And I found that very helpful. And another lesson that I really learned is around communication. Particularly in situations like that, you learn how important it is to keep everybody on track, make sure that people feel heard, but people also get the right type of information. And also sometimes to share the burden. An example, for example, we got every day huge deliveries in of humanitarian goods that we could distribute, but people were dying because of dehydration, of various things, because they had fled from the violence. They were living under horrible conditions in the jungles. And I remember this situation where we had to decide, we only had so and so much goods to distribute, and we had to decide between two areas. And we knew, regardless of how we decide, whether we take area A or area B, we're going to lose people. Because of our decision, people will die. And it was super hard, but we took it as a team and as best as we could, so we could stand up to that decision. And we ultimately did one area and we managed to save many, but we also lost others because of our decision. But we did it as a team.
Wow, it's so heartbreaking, right? I mean, what you have experienced is absolutely incredible. I was curious to get your view on what do you believe from having been to all these conflict zones? What do you believe is a source of human conflict?
Yeah, I mean, having been in many different conflicts and some of the oldest in the world, I mean, there's many reasons. Every conflict has its own origins and it takes on different dynamics over time. Very often it really comes back to personalities, wrong leadership decisions, I think, very little also vision forward. Sometimes you really have to think very far. But one of the key elements is really that people feel not heard. Yeah. And eventually they may have to distort to violence to get what they need or want. So I think that's why I'm ultimately also a diplomat, because as a diplomat you really listen to everyone, and that's important, because I think we have to be always really mindful with ideologies, because ideologies are often very one-sided. And that's where it comes in, that there has to be an attitude of, okay, I listen, and then we try to find together the right solution. And also realizing that there is no quick fix. Most conflicts, you don't fix them overnight. It takes stamina. And I remember I had a conversation once with ex-President Santos, who won the Nobel Prize for having found peace, or with the FARC rebels who had been fighting for decades in Colombia. And I was in Colombia myself for 2 years, and I met many of the FARC leaders. And it's incredibly hard. I remember so well when he was saying, like, there were so many forces even within my own circle that didn't want peace. Yeah. So it's a question of really standing your ground, standing your course, and really believing that there is a solution. Because ultimately conflicts then spin very quickly out of control, and the human suffering is massive. So today, for example, if we look for around conflicts around the world, the majority of conflicts is not fought between soldiers. The victims, most of the victims in conflicts today are civilians. Yeah. So in comparison, kind of what we would call soldiers, or what in the international context, international law, is a combatant, this is just a minority of the people who suffer in conflict.
Incredible. How long did it take you to resolve your own PTSD issues?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And see, PTSD is a very challenging beast, yeah, because PTSD stays with you for life. You don't get rid
Yeah.
of it. It's more a question of how you manage it, yeah. And I give you an example. Um, I had a colleague, and she was also attacked. I think it was somewhere in the DRC. They went to a checkpoint. Suddenly, there was an attack on them. They barely survived. She basically left the humanitarian sector. She went back. She was Brazilian. She went back, and then she went out for one night with her friends to a discotheque, and they were dancing and things like that. And suddenly, I mean, you can just imagine this, on the beach, everybody's dancing, it's fun and everything. And suddenly she has a complete meltdown. She breaks down on the dance floor and so on. And what did they find out afterwards is that the music that was playing was a song that was playing in a radio on that particular checkpoint when they were attacked. So it triggered this very, very strong memory. And in that sense, PTSD is super tough. And we see that a lot also. I was working, for example, years ago, I was invited to Chicago to work with US veterans who had come back from combat. And I come into this room, and there's all these machines, big guys, you think like, gosh, scary. But they were potatoes. They were completely fried, internally burned out. Yeah. Severe PTSD. And I remember like how many of them were crying on this table. And it was so impressive. And what we realize is many of us come from these traumas, and they bring this PTSD. For me personally, my learnings were the following. So what really saved me in many ways, I was given the choice in the Central African Republic. After everything had happened, Geneva called me and said, Christoph, you can come home, but we don't have a replacement for you. And that would have meant we would have had to stop our operations, because I was the only one, as I was basically the expat. I had the access to the prisons, to all these places, which my national colleagues didn't have. Yeah. And suddenly I I saw, if I go, many people will die. So for quite obvious reasons, or I mean, for me at least clear reasons, I said, no, I stay. I will try to keep track. And it was actually my saving, because the purpose of being there and helping those people was my best savior. Despite of the fact that the everyday life was horrible, every night was nightmares, it was no appetite. It was this never ending thing. But it was almost like I needed to break that lock. And after weeks, it started to get better. And it took me really months to overcome that, but it had to do a lot also with strong discipline. So, for example, I continued doing sports. I run almost every day, continue that to this day. But And I confronted myself also with the trauma. I didn't try to push it down. It's like, oh no, it's all good, it's all good, because there where the danger starts. PTSD is so severe, you have to face it. You stand there, you see it, you understand it. And of course, in an ideal situation, there's many professional ways to deal with it. There's treatments that also work. That's why ideally, um, that's why many people who have PTSD actually end up committing suicide. That's why also many, for example, ex-combatants commit suicide. There's more ex-combatants dying of suicide than in actual combat, because they can't deal with the trauma. Nobody understands it. If I come home and say like, oh, I was just in the war zone and I was shot at and things like that, and you come back to Switzerland, I don't walk down the street here and I'm being shot at. So, of course, the people in your close circles, even though they may show a lot of empathy and sympathy towards you, you have been there and you've experienced something that they hopefully never experience in their lives.
Thank you so much for sharing. And as I'm thinking and as I'm listening to your story, what comes to mind is young emerging leaders that are striving to actually find fulfillment in their careers while also navigating various complexities in today's world. What advice would you have for them, particularly someone that is maybe making a career choice or even choosing which field to pursue despite potential obstacles or challenges that may come their way?
Yes, a difficult question. I mean, ultimately, I learned one thing. So if I look, for example, about my own career, yeah, if I kind of break it down for a brief one here, I mean, for the first few years of my life, I was an artist. So I was living in Paris and I was living in London, and I was painting, and I made a living from painting. Um, and that was wonderful, but I needed more and I wanted more. And that's why I also launched a number of humanitarian expeditions at that time and so on. And I worked with these homeless people and so on. And eventually I did a U-turn, as I say, I did a U-turn on the highway and I became a humanitarian. Surprisingly enough, they offered me also a job. So that was surprising. You come as an artist from Paris and you're like saying, oh, I want to be a humanitarian. And it actually worked out. I was always very curious. I always wanted to widen that field. Then later I joined the UN. I was in charge of some of the largest refugee camps in the Middle East. Also, my work with the ICRC brought me for many years. I mean, I was for 6 years. I was Colombia, Central African Republic. I was in the Middle East. I was in Nepal during the Civil War. And from then on, interestingly, I came to the World Economic Forum and I worked on their whole humanitarian programs, bringing private sector actors in, which also opened another new perspective for me. And for a few years, I was then CEO of World Vision Switzerland and Liechtenstein, the children's charity. And now I work for one of the largest companies in the world, Holcim, which provides building solutions all over the world. And I'm heading globally their human rights and social impact portfolio. So there's a different angle and aspect in all of these jobs, and I find a lot of fulfillment in all of them. So I think my advice is really more, I mean, as cliche as it sounds, listen to your heart. And I think sometimes it's also choose experiences over maybe the biggest, let's say, like gain. Some people that just say, I just want to go somewhere where I earn a lot of money. Yeah. My perspective was always, can I combine my professional career or what I do with creating positive impact for others, still having a lot of fun, and actually also being able to survive from it? I think in the very, very early days, I was super idealistic and I was maybe throwing myself almost too much into just helping others. But eventually, you also need to survive. I mean, now, I have a family, we have a small son, another baby to come soon. So of course, you also need to make sure that you actually you can afford a life, and a proper life. Um, but there is something quite beautiful about different experiences. And I think the important part here for me was what always helped me is, and I come back to what I said in the very beginning, is it's about experiential learning. The more we expose ourselves to various different things, the more we start to understand. Yeah. And I always said that for me, every time I would be speaking to somebody else, and particularly when it's like also it's like difficult conversations sometimes, it would be almost like as if it's a mirror to myself. I would find myself much more in these situations rather than, I don't know, sitting down doing yoga for hours and thinking I have to find myself. Never worked for me. I was the person, I wanted to go out. For example, I went for a week to the slums in Bombay where I was working on a leprosy program because I'd been working for years on leprosy. And it opened a whole different perspective for me on how, first of all, is life in one of the world's largest slums, and who are these people who live there, because suddenly to me they had a name, they had a story, they had a family, they had their daily struggles. And once again, I understood a lot about them, but I understood a lot more about myself.
I know you've done multiple films, and this is really showing also your continued artistic endeavors, since you were sharing earlier that you did a lot of paintings before. I know that one of your films, Alegria, has won more than 40 international film awards and has been shown in over 50 countries. Can you share with our audience more about what inspired you to make that movie and some of the other movies that you've made more recently?
Yeah, I think Alegria is a very important one. Sometimes I always say, sometimes you do a small thing and it completely gets out of hand in a positive sense. Yeah, I did over my years, and already during my artistic times, I did these humanitarian expeditions. So, for example, one of them was I cycled from India to Switzerland in an expedition called Bike for Help, where I was fundraising and raising awareness for people affected by leprosy. Started as a small idea on my student desk in London. One day I thought, okay, let's do that. 10,000 kilometers with a bicycle, 4,000 kilometers of desert, and it was pretty crazy. As always, I just wanted to get it done. And I did it, and it reached worldwide attention, partially also because I had to negotiate with the Taliban. It was the war in Afghanistan. It was just after 9/11. The borders were closed. Everything was difficult. And suddenly I found myself in the middle of all of this chaos. Um, but to the cause of leprosy, it was amazing. And I created a foundation called the Color the World Foundation that took for more than 20 years care of leprosy patients all over the world. So a side effect of all of that. But to come to Alegria, Alegria was then my second big expedition, where I decided to cycle across the entire Himalaya, across the highest roads in the world, from Nepal to India, through all these one big Himalayan mountain after the other, because the Himalayas is a mountain range. It's not just one mountain. Like with the others, it was quite amazing. So before I started to go off on the bicycle trip, before I started to actually push the pedal for the first time, I was spending an entire month, and in this case, Alegria was for what we call mentally destitute women, women who have psychological challenges and are often left out in the streets by their family, which is a big phenomenon in India, but also in other parts of the world. And I spent an entire month with these women. I was working very closely and still work with an organization called the Banyan in India, who's the biggest organization working with these women. And it was super powerful because, again, for a whole month I was there. I understood the work, I understood these women better. I met so many different people, and of course it was a huge boost to do this. And the cool part was, I did something that I really enjoyed. Of course it was a bit extreme, I want to say, but I love cycling and I love traveling by bicycle, so it was an amazing thing. But at the same time, it created so much attention, because why would this Swiss guy go out there, do all of this, and so on? Um, and so I could really combine doing something good with something that was fun for me, and at the same time, transmit a message that is important. And then I actually, as I was on this expedition, I was filming also, and I never actually intended to do a documentary. I came back and I did this documentary, and then suddenly it got out of control. It was all over the world. I won the London Film Awards, the Barcelona Film Awards, many others, because it really started moving people, this whole thing. Because, yeah, I was hit by a rock fall. There was a lot of very challenging moments during this expedition.
Incredible journeys, Christoph. And with all these various experiences and all the key unique cities and countries that you have been to, What have you learned about joy in the process?
Yeah, so joy has always been part of this, and it's it's interesting. If you sometimes hear some of these stories, you think like, oh, Central African Republic and all these difficult things and all I saw in my life and experienced really a huge amount of human suffering. Yeah. I witnessed that often, of course, being in the privileged situation that I knew I could just go home and go to my safe haven. But at the same time, it really made me also very joyful because one, I was there and I was one part of an element trying to improve the situation of these people. So the pure fact of having purpose and doing something created an enormous amount of joy. And I think again, one important element of joy I feel is not to put myself at the center. Yeah. It's them and it's all about them. And that's when the joy comes my experience is it just comes automatically, and even more so because it's very profound. I can profoundly feel joy because maybe I made somebody else's life better. That's why I'm coming back again to the whole notion of experiential learning. That's why I think it's so important that we need to get a bit away from our digital devices and go into this world and see and meet people and don't be afraid of them. Yeah. I went to some really, as we would call, the darkest places on the planet, and I found so much joy often. I found incredible people. And I realized it's just sometimes in our minds. Fear is in our minds. We create barriers that we actually don't need, they're artificial. It's a question between what is a real risk and what is a perceived risk. And in most cases, I realized we talk about perceived risks. But one part I find also in joy is if we see things, if we see injustice, if we see things that we do really deeply care about, what brings joy is actually to stand up and do something about it. I think that's an important element. I think there's a lot of frustration coming if you actually don't do that. If you don't, again, the notion again, if you don't listen to your heart, and this is the same, whatever professional choices you make, your personal choices in life, I think ultimately we really need to guide that from what comes deep from within ourselves and from what we experience actually within others.
And this brings me beautifully to your motto, which is to be brave, be kind, and be bold, which I think is really, really powerful. For our listeners who may want to bring more bravery, kindness, and boldness to their own lives, what would be the first step that you would recommend that they take?
Get off your digital devices. I truly think go out there and just experience that. We live in times, I think, where there's so much division and we have forces that try to divide us. And what is division often based on? It's on fear, and it's based on the fact that I don't know the unknown. Um, I always think I don't know what I don't know, and this is what it taught me so much. So many of these encounters in these places, whether that's one of the leprosy patients, A Horn, that I met in Cambodia, and she said to me, "You know what, Christoph, you come all the way from Switzerland to help us. It makes me feel important." It was one of the most moving moments of my life. This woman feeling important. And I think that's the gift to give sometimes. But it also means not to be too afraid, actually, just to reach out and not to believe in divisions. Because it's almost like people that are strange to me or cultures, I could always be afraid of them, but I can also like head on go there, try to face it. At least I can even afterwards still say, I don't like it, I don't agree with this, but at least I made the effort and I made that step to understand, which ultimately would widen my perspective. But I also strongly believe that this is not the kind of stuff that we're learning on YouTube or other channels. This is where we need to feel a person in front of us, smell, get a sense of a smile, get all of these things. that's, I think, what makes us human, and what makes them human ultimately to us.
Beautiful. And if there would be a recipe for joy and living more joyfully, what would be the three main ingredients in your view?
So one of them, I think, is appreciate simplicity. Yeah, I think the simple things in life are beautiful. I love, for example, I love running because I go to the forest, and for me, it's zen. I just appreciate the calmness of the forest, of this, yeah, having trees around me that are far more older than me. That is something quite humbling. The second thing is really what I shared before in terms of leadership. Say thank you a lot. I think there's many people in our lives to say thank you. And I'm saying this also because none of us are where we are because we are where we are because there have been people on our path that helped us. And they maybe just did it simply because they believed in us. For many of us, it's our parents who believed in us. Something to be grateful about, because and something to pass on, you know, what I'm trying to do with our family and with other people. And probably the last one is listen and speak less. You know, I think it's so important to listen to people and give them this moment of importance. Like Ehun, who shared her story with me. And for that very particular moment, she was the most important person in the room. My role was simply to sit there and to listen to her story and to give her that moment of presence.
This brings me also to all the incredible people that you have met and the incredible pictures that you have taken. And I know you have an upcoming book that condenses all your adventures. Would you like to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I've actually already written one book which is called Bike for Help, and it's also available on Amazon. So it's a book about this expedition from India to Switzerland. And then my second book, which is just being completed, is called War, Love, Hope. And what the book actually looks at, so it's from my 10 years of working and living in conflicts around the world. But I look at it from a very humane angle. So based basically on true stories, on moments that I experienced, whether these were hostage negotiations or very other various situations. I look at the human angle of conflict, but I also look at actually the hope and the love that I found. You know, sometimes I still remember once I was in the middle of a battlefield and there was something written on a wall, and it was, I will never forget that, and it was like, hope is like a star in a pile of shit. There was something very powerful about that, because one of the learnings that I had was hope really dies the last. Even in the most dire places, dire situations, hope is there, and people have hope that things are getting better. And that was very, very powerful. And these are some of the messages that I bring up in the book. So there's an element of reflection in there, but there's an element of humanity, really meeting these people, giving them a voice. And of course, there's a lot of the learnings that I'm sharing that I've taken away over these years, whether it's personal or leadership or life choices, that I've really tried to condense on these 200 pages.
Amazing. Really look forward to reading it. Christoph, in one of your recent films, you capture the global adventures you have been on with Valentine. Tell us about how you met and what you have discovered about love, beauty, and joy in the last few years.
Yeah, so I was very privileged to meet my wife Valentine, who actually, and we met in a non-digital way. So she moved into the apartment next to me, literally door to door. And eventually, after quite some time, first being friends, we actually fell in love and we became a couple. And soon after that, we both left our jobs and we decided to go on a big bike trip, because I had given Valentine my book, Bike for Help, which she had read. And she said, like, if I want to be with this guy, I need to speak his language, which means we needed to go together on a bike trip. But Valentine was deadly afraid even to cycle in Geneva, in a super safe city, but she was determined to do it. And so we left actually for half a year and cycled across Asia, 3,500 kilometers across Laos, Cambodia, India, and Nepal. And it was an incredible journey because not only that we were on this bicycle expedition together and we had all these incredible experiences, um, we also stopped for a month to work with the projects of mentally destitute women in the south of India. We were in Chennai, and it was wonderful just to do this together and give also, give that journey a purpose, a strong purpose. And we both always had that. She independently, she had done her own work with that in the past, and so that was really beautiful. And of course, now our family is growing. I mean, we continue cycling, and we have now a little Louis who's almost 2 years old and another baby on the way. And Louis is already a big traveler. We just came back from a trip to Morocco. We have been already on a few bicycle trips and camping trips with him. So I pull him in the trailer behind me, and he absolutely loves it.
So happy to hear that. Thank you. And so happy also that the family is expanding. Really, really beautiful. Any final words of wisdom that you may wish to share with our audience as it connects to leadership, joy, and all your amazing experiences that you have shared?
Yeah, I think the last is, again, in challenging times that we're in today, just don't stop to believe in the North Star. Don't believe everything that you hear. Don't take the simple messages. I think it's try really to listen and to understand, and you will make wiser choices. And I think we all will make wiser choices of how our future is going to look like. And we are in a pivotal moment of this world. And I think that's why we need to really bring back humanity. We need to bring back empathy, and we need to bring back a lot of hope.
Christoph, it's been an immense pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well. Thank you so much.